Is it 30,000, 40,000, or 100,000? No one knows for sure, but lawyers, marriage counselors, and private detectives agree. The number of women who are leaving husband, home, and children is dramatically on the rise. By now, of course, divorce is old hat. 1 out of 3 American marriages ends that way. But what is new is the number of women frustrated by a life they call barren and emboldened by the women's liberation movement who are just walking away from their marriages. Who is the runaway wife, the dropout wife?
Meet Wanda Adams of Seattle, Washington. Back in the 50s, she was a top student at Washington State, the May Queen, a finalist for Sweetheart of Sigma Chi. She married her college sweetheart 3 days after her 21st birthday, and they stayed married for 14 years. Here's Don Adams, big man on campus at Washington State in the 50s, outstanding senior of the class of 1959, president of the Interfraternity Council. Now he's an executive with the Boeing Company. 2 years ago, Wanda took off, walked out, leaving behind her husband, a comfortable home, and 3 handsome kids. Pat and Christopher, who were then 6 and 7, Susan, who was 10. Wanda had grown restless. She returned to work, got caught up in the radical scene at the University of Washington, and found herself alienated from Don and the kids. Finally, as we said, 2 years ago, she just up and walked out. At first, leaving all 3 children with Don, then deciding to take her daughter Susan, now 12, with her across town to the counterculture neighborhood of Seattle, where, now divorced and accepting neither alimony nor child support, she lives in a dilapidated old Victorian house that she's trying to turn into a women's center.
What did you expect out of marriage?
Well, I think I expected more or less the traditional thing, American dream, so to speak, that, well, really, all I ever wanted to do was to get married and have babies. My mother says the same thing about me. And I just had this sort of vision of myself being happy and wafting through the house in a pink pen wall with, you know, the baby in my arms. But I really believed that I would be happy doing that.
It didn't work out that way. Why?
It's too difficult, living in the kind of isolation that families have now, being tied to the home and to children, talking to 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, and rarely seeing another adult, unless it's a neighborhood woman for coffee. And I had been through college, and I had taught for a couple years, and I missed that. I missed the contacts that I had. You may have had outside interests, but you give up on many. Symbolically, you give up on your name in most cases. And I think that's the beginning of the loss of identity.
We got married in the late, in 1957, and that was, the marriage was another step in what was to be a relatively routine life. You go to high school and you graduate, you go to college, you graduate, you get married, and you find a job, and then you start to grow within your job, and you make more money, and you buy a bigger house.
Anything wrong with it?
Well, just looking at it right now, it looks sort of a bleak existence.
You mean you like what's happened to you?
I like what's happened to me since. I do.
Really?
I feel very good. I think it's offered challenges which people don't normally face.
Were you hurt, Don?
I think I was hurt because traditionally you feel that you can, or at least I always have felt that I could work through all my problems. And I think the major thing that bothered me was acceptance.
Did it make you feel less than a man?
No, I never felt that way. I never really have felt inadequate as a result of what happened. I have too much pride in myself, I think, and that's why I was never really afraid that I would have a problem with taking care of the children.
He takes care of them all by himself and had no hesitancy in talking to us in front of them. Weekdays are hectic. After breakfast, Don drops one of the boys off at the daycare center a block from home. From there, it's on to school another block away. After school, Pat and Chris return to the daycare center where Don picks them up when his workday ends. Wanda, meantime, is in the thick of Seattle's burgeoning women's movement. She spends her time not only raising Susan, but raising the consciousness of other women at rap sessions and at occasional lunches with other wives who have walked out.
I feel that it's difficult to make some people understand, you know, when you say that you want to, when I say that Dawn and I grew apart, which we did, completely different direction. We were completely different places. And that I wanted to lead my own life, you know.
Yeah.
And people just don't,
People don't believe that?
you've got to say something like he was beating me or...
You were in love with somebody else.
Oh, I was in love with
something
somebody
else.
Yeah. Myself.
She suggested to us that, in a sense, she began to outgrow you. And by outgrow, I mean that she grew in a different direction.
She definitely did. I was definitely not a conservative. I wasn't a radical liberal. And this caused her to seek a different circle of friends. And it caused me to entrench within the ones that I had. And so I was coming from a relatively conservative background, working in a very conservative company, and she was involved in a very radical background. And it caused that was, I suppose, our major conflict.
He had friends that I had difficulty getting along with. I had friends that he had difficulty getting along with. So I think there was that kind of jealousy. I think that to some extent he was jealous of my achievements in school, in work, and so forth. Now, at that point, I was not jealous of him, but I had been when I was home. You know, I was jealous of the fact that he could leave the house every day and see other adults who were involved in what I thought were interesting activities, and he could be out in the community. He had a kind of freedom that I didn't have.
Marriage and your home were a kind of prison.
Right.
She's a very strong woman.
Definitely. Very
determined
strong.
woman.
Yes.
A leader?
Oh, I would say definitely a leader.
Was she, in a sense, the leader in your own family?
Oh, I hesitate to say that. Maybe my ego was being struck when I would respond. I don't know how to respond to that. I've always thought of myself as being a leader also. In our family, I think she was the stronger one with regard to our relationship. I do think that.
And so when she came to you and said, look, I've had it and I'm going to walk.
Mm-hmm. That's not essentially the way it went, but I got the picture. She walked. And
despite the real bitterness and anger there surely must have been, today Don and Wanda have only kind words about each other, though they both rule out any chance of reconciliation.
Don was the kind of husband who really tried. You know, he did the dishes, and you know, it's sometimes I feel like people think that is the greatest battle. If you just get your husband to do the dishes, you know, or run the vacuum, you've got it licked. But I still felt that I was taking care of, I had the responsibility for 5 people.
Well, all right. Look, you undertook a responsibility. I don't mean that once you've undertaken a responsibility, you can't get out from under it, but you undertook a responsibility for yourself, for Don, and for 3 kids. You're a grown person.
And what you're really saying is that I left that responsibility.
Didn't you?
No, I don't see it that way, because I think that I still fulfill a commitment or a responsibility to everyone. Now, I'm not being a wife anymore. I'm really not even what you'd call a traditional mother.
Meantime, the kids, let's say, who are strewn in your path are the ones who suffer.
Oh, you really think that? I don't. Or are you just being the devil's advocate?
To a certain extent, I'm being a devil's advocate, sure.
I think that the children would have suffered if we had stayed together. And I think they would have suffered much more. The few weeks before I left, I realized that for the first time in our marriage, 14 years of marriage, that I was taking out my tensions on the children. Now, I don't think that would have ended, and I don't think therapy would have helped and all of that rigmarole that many people try to go through. I don't think the children are suffering now. I really don't.
Patrick, do you miss living with your mother?
Yeah.
You do?
I think it is difficult for the children, and but it's one which I think it's the best one worked out. It would have been very difficult for her to raise 3 children. It would have been extremely difficult for me to raise 3 children.
Although many dropout wives may be influenced by women's lib, by no means all of them get caught up in the movement the way that Wanda Adams has and change their lifestyle so drastically. Faithfully every week, she leads a rap session at her home.
Would you like to pass the line down? Yes. I need a beer.
You know, like we're all sitting here talking about daughters. Did you ever think of that? No, except for you. You're talking about your son, but to a large extent we are talking about daughters because that it's somehow a little bit easier, I guess. I really
Yeah, I'm really scared to death in many ways of my sons.
Oh, but yours are still young, Wanda.
Well, year by year goes by and I'm still saying that.
At the rap session the other night, you said you were scared of your sons. What do you mean?
Well, I was scared of them in the sense that I don't have the kind of relationship with them that I have with Susan now. It's not as easy for me to talk to them. So it's difficult for me at times to be with them because I want a kind of intimacy that I don't have.
You see the boys 2 days out of the week, and you see Susan every day, obviously.
Well, yes and no.
But, no, I mean, she's your responsibility, right? And you have chores around this house.
And what's the difference?
No, that's way too much. Grate about half of that, and then let's see how much there is. And then you have to make the base first.
When we have company, I don't have to apologize if the house isn't spick and span. And frankly, no one expects me to. Before, there was always that kind of feeling underneath that, I should be serving the guests, I should be doing, something, be responsible for their welfare, and as well as for my family. In other words, I felt weighed down with all of the roles that I had to play as a wife.
What would you think of a fella, husband, took off, left his kids, left his wife? What do you think of a man who does that?
Well, I'd like to think that intellectually I could understand part of it. But I think that it's very difficult to understand a person who just totally walks out on the whole thing. Who makes no effort to work through problems with the family, the wife and the children. And I think I would feel the same way about a woman, too, even though I might have more empathy for the pressure that she had been under.
What in the world is this pressure? Look, I know that being a mother and a wife and a housekeeper and a homemaker and all of those things are tough. But a man has chores every day, too. He goes to work frequently at a job he doesn't like.
But I think women have an unequal responsibility in many cases. I don't think that they're really getting the kind of support financially. I mean, housework isn't, there's no financial reward in housework, really.
Well, that's your home.
And it's hard work.
Oh, well, of course it's hard work, but there's your home.
But is it your home? In most states, it is not your home. It's your husband's home. And that money is his, and he can go out and buy anything he wants to, never without your signing your name, without the wife signing her name to the contract. And she doesn't have that right or that privilege. Even after I left, and we were separated, but still legally married, and I moved into this house, they had to check with him when I wanted to order oil for the furnace, for heaven's sake.
Who supports you now?
Well, I'm not employed right now. And it's a difficult thing for me to talk about because, for instance, I was working at North Seattle Community College at one point. And when people learned that I had left my children and so forth, I was seen as an irresponsible, immoral woman, and the taxpayers were up in arms over paying my salary. And how can we let such a person work with young children?
So for the last few months, Wanda Adams has been on welfare, but she's about to begin a new job driving a school bus. Unlike Wanda, more and more women are just running away, disappearing completely into cities across America. And their startled husbands are turning to private detective agencies like Tracer's Company for help. A decade ago, says Tracer's president Ed Goldfader, virtually all the runaways he looked for were husbands. Today, he says, it's all even. One runaway wife for every runaway husband.
I see a syndrome or a spread, a range of people, not necessarily all falling into one category. That is, women of varying maturities, intellectually, I mean, of varying interests. For example, from the simplest situation of a woman who got married thinking that marriage was fun and games and now is faced with the drudgery of housework, or has been faced with it for many years, to the highly intellectual, highly intelligent woman who thought that marriage was going to be an opportunity for her to be a helpmate to her husband in his career aspirations, and finds now that he's so busy clawing his way through during the week that when he does get a free moment on the weekend, it's the neighbor's wife that he makes a pass at, not his own.
Has women's liberation contributed mightily to this whole phenomenon? of the runaway, the dropout wife?
There's no question in my mind that it has. Not necessarily just the movement itself, but the exposure that the movement has had to the public. What it really has done, it has given the woman who has been smoldering with some discontent and not really being able to identify it and certainly not knowing what to do about it, a direction that she has never had before.
You think that there are a lot of women who feel the way you did and would like to do what you've done?
Yes, I know that. I know that. I would say that there must be, for every one of us who does it, there must be, 50 or 75 or 100 that would like to do it.